This is the story of a young girl who, born in an age when physical deformities were not understood or accepted, was kept as a prisoner by her parents and then abandoned in a strange city. She should have become, by human nature, bitter and angry. But this young girl did not become bitter or angry. No, God had too big of plans for her to be spoiled with self-pity. Instead, he destined that this small, blind, and disfigured young woman would become a great saint. Margaret was born in Perugia, Italy in 1287. Her parents, Parisio and Emilia, were royals who lived in the Maitola castle near Mercatello nel Motoro. Politically prominent and very wealthy, Parisio was more than a nobleman. He served as a garrison at the castle and was also the captain of the people, which meant he exercised authority over the rest of the land and in time of war became commander-in-chief of the armies. Although greatly esteemed and successful in the eyes of the world, Parisio was proud and indifferent to the sufferings of others. His wife, Lady Emilia, is described as a woman of weak character under the domination of her husband. She too was self-absorbed and cared only of things of the world, so it wouldn't be too much of a surprise to us when we learn that these two parents were not only horrified when their daughter was born, but angry with God. Not only was their baby a girl and not a boy, which was the first offense, but she was also deformed with a severe curvature of the spine, was extremely small, and one foot was shorter than the other by 1.5 inches. Not only that, but a few days later, they realized the baby was also blind. So embarrassed were the parents that they did not announce with joy the birth of their firstborn as people expected. The bells did not ring and the flags were not flown. Instead, the people were told that the baby was very ill and not expected to live for long. And from that time on, Parisio and Emilia kept their daughter a secret. Only the servants in the castle knew of the baby's existence, and they were strictly forbidden to tell anyone. The chaplain of the fort, Padre Capilano, insisted that the parents have the baby baptized, to which they refused because it meant taking the baby out in public to the cathedral, where all baptisms were performed, except in emergencies. Padre Capilano pleaded with Lady Emilia, and finally she gave in and had her maid take the baby to the cathedral. A name was needed, but the parents hadn't even thought to give her one. They told the maid to choose whatever name she wanted, anything but Emilia. And so the maid named the baby Margaret, without giving too much thought about it. We know that God chose this name, as it means pearl, and no one would have thought to name this unwanted baby after such a symbol of perfection and beauty. Despite her physical handicaps, Margaret was very intelligent. At 5 years old, she knew her way through every corridor of the massive castle without any assistance, and she knew the name of every person who worked in the castle, even though she was blind. She was very friendly and cheerful, and visited whoever would talk to her. However, she knew not to visit the quarters where her parents lived, because they didn't want to see her. She enjoyed visiting the chapel in the castle, where she spent much of her time praying. However, at 6 years old, the secret of Parisio and Emilia was almost discovered when a visitor saw Margaret walking around the castle and asked about her. A servant intervened before the secret was out, and after this close call, Parisio ordered a small cell to be built next to the church, which was out of sight to visitors. Here, Margaret would spend the next 12 years of her life. Her cell was small, cold in the winter, and hot in the summer. Only in the spring and fall did Margaret feel any relief from the climate. Her one joy was that the chapel was nearby her cell, and she spent the day in meditation and prayer, and at times was able to go to Mass. The only visitor she received was the priest, who taught her catechism and prayers. Her mother visited her maybe once a week, but her father hardly ever came. When Margaret asked him why she was being hidden away, he told her that it was because she was a freak. When she asked what a freak was, he told her that it was someone who was lame, hunchbacked, blind, and ugly. When the priest came to visit Margaret, she was in tears as she told him what her father had said. Thinking that she was crying over the hurt that her father caused her, He was more than surprised when Margaret said, "Father, at first I did not understand why this happened to me, but now he has made it clear. Jesus was rejected by his own people, and God is allowing me to be treated the same way so that I can follow our dear Lord more closely. But I am not worthy." She considered herself too unworthy of such a gift. The years slowly passed by, and one day, during her 13th year in her little prison, the city was invaded, causing an imminent threat to the castle. Parisio, being the captain of the people, had to take charge against the invaders, but before leaving, he ordered his wife and daughter to be taken to the fortress in Mercatello, where his wife would be safe and his daughter hidden. Unfortunately, this was not Margaret's chance for freedom. She was barricaded in the underground vault in the fortress. There was nothing in this new prison except for an old bench to sit and sleep on. Upon arrival, she was informed of her new rules. She would be fed twice a day, and in no way was she ever to call out or make any noise. She must be quiet at all times. Then the sound of the wooden door slammed shut, with bolts being slid into their pockets, and Margaret was once again all alone. This new prison was much harder for Margaret than her first one. In her first prison, she at least was allowed to go to Mass since her cell was connected to the old church, and she received visits from the priest. She was also able to receive the sacraments of penance and the Holy Eucharist, but now she had nothing to do but to wait and pray. Most people who face such rejection, especially from their parents, would become bitter and angry. But Margaret worked hard to never become bitter. Although she was gifted with kindness and patience, she was human, and at times she was tempted to give in to her hurt and anger. She spent her time working against this temptation by praying for her parents and her country, and especially for her father, whose life was always in danger. After months of fighting, a treaty was signed, and the servant who brought Margaret her meals told her that the war was over. Margaret was giddy with a joy she rarely felt. God had heard her prayers and answered her. God was so good to her. In 1303, after learning of miracles that were happening at a shrine in Castello, Amelia suggested to Parisio to take Margaret to have her pray for a cure. As Parisio normally scoffed at such things, she didn't expect him to agree, but was taken by surprise when he seemed to be enthusiastic about the idea. If Margaret was cured, then they would no longer need to go through the stress of constantly guarding their secret, and all their problems would be gone. As for Amelia, after so many stressful months of the war, she was excited to go somewhere new. They left early in the morning before any travelers were out and about, guarded by their soldiers who surrounded them and concealed Margaret, who was hidden under a cloak. Once they arrived in Castello, Margaret's parents brought her to the shrine, and her father said to her, "I want you, my dear child, to pray with all your heart and soul for a complete cure. You will obey me in this matter, won't you, Margaret?" Margaret never heard her father speak to her so sweetly before, especially being called his dear child, and she answered, "Oh yes, Father, with all my heart." And so they settled her in front of the tomb of the saint, and as pilgrims walked around her, she prayed for hours for a cure. Her parents waited around, took a walk, did some shopping, and then came back to the shrine, expecting to see Margaret whole, well, and beautiful. Instead, they saw the same daughter they had brought, and along with great disappointment came anger. With that, Parisio motioned to his wife to follow him, and they left the city, never to return. As for Margaret, she prayed all day for a cure, but she added in the prayer, "Only if it is your will." It wasn't until the priest announced the church was closing that she realized the night had come, and that her parents had not. Margaret was forced to spend the night out in the cold on the church's steps. She didn't want to go anywhere in case her parents came back. In the morning, some beggars who normally came to beg at the front of the church found her, and after learning that her parents left their disabled and blind daughter alone in a strange city where she could get hurt, they had many angry words for them. But although Margaret was initially in shock at her parents' actions and deeply hurt, she didn't allow anyone to speak ill of them. She reasoned that she was 20 years old, much to the shock of the beggars, who thought she was only 14, and that they should not have to be burdened with her for the rest of their lives. She could take care of herself, although at that moment she wasn't sure how. It was the beggars of the city who took care of Margaret. They took her around the city to help her get acquainted with it, learned the areas to stay away from, and showed her the fountain where she could get water and the best places to beg for food and money. Over time, the townspeople saw the goodness and cheerfulness of Margaret despite her circumstances and took her in. She was passed from house to house of the poor, as the rich did not yet trust her story, and each family took care of Margaret for as long as they could. When they were no longer able to financially help her, she was passed on to the next family. The peaceful presence of Margaret in the house was a gift, and over time, families stopped their bickering or quarreling and became more thoughtful of their souls when previously they had been indifferent. About a year or two of being shuffled from house to house, a nearby convent who had heard about Margaret and her holiness received permission to take her in as part of the community. Margaret was ecstatic with joy, because not only was this her first permanent home, but also her first family. The sisters loved Margaret right away, as she was humble, friendly, and grateful. They were also surprised that Margaret was able to take care of herself and help with the chores despite her blindness. And so, Margaret's new life at the convent seemed to take a happy turn. However, this was not to last. Margaret's fervent spirit was too much for the nuns, and as they no longer followed the rule of the convent as faithfully as she did, they felt a constant unspoken reproach. The superior tried to reason with Margaret that the rule had been written ages ago, and it was no longer expected to be followed so strictly in the present day. And so, Margaret was told to relax because she was making the other nuns testy and uncomfortable. For a short time, Margaret was torn. Although the answer may seem obvious to us, Margaret was holy but also very human. She, who had been neglected and unloved all her life, finally found a family. This would be hard to give up, but she felt uncomfortable too. After praying and talking to her confessor, she knew what to do. She would not abandon God in her vows. And so, only a short time later, Margaret was expelled from the convent for failing in obedience to the superior. Once again, Margaret was on the streets. The news that Margaret was kicked out of the convent spread around town, and at first, people were indignant and angry. But after learning from the nuns that Margaret could not seem to adjust to the convent life and would not follow the rules, the townspeople turned against Margaret. Even the children, who overheard the adults' conversations, would scorn and mock Margaret when they saw her in the streets. Margaret had to bear this new trial, and she did so with patience and charity. After a few months, the people of the town began to see the difference between the attitude of the nuns and the charitable attitude of Margaret. They began to look more closely at the convent, and from the accusations they had against Margaret, it became clear what had really happened. They once again embraced Margaret and held her in even higher esteem for persevering in charity and never once defending herself, even though she had every right to do so. Once again, the town resumed the care for Margaret, and in return for their kindness, she opened a small school for the children of the town, where she taught them catechism and the psalms she had memorized during her time at the convent. Margaret was kind but quiet. She was not a big talker, except for when it came to St. Joseph. During that time, the devotion to St. Joseph was not yet practiced, yet Margaret had a great love for him. Perhaps she could relate to the quiet saint who was constantly overlooked. She would get so lost in her zeal for St. Joseph, the people learned not to bring him up if they were ever in a hurry. Because Margaret would go on and on about him, sometimes people ended up sneaking away, as she could talk for hours. Knowing of Margaret's desire to be part of a religious order, it was suggested she join the Montellate, where lay women who were members of the Order of Penance of St. Dominic lived a life of religious order, but still could live at home. It took a little bit of time to sort it all out, because the women of the Montellate were normally older women who were widowed, and Margaret was still very young and single. However, an exception was made for Margaret based on her good reputation and her fervent love for God. Margaret had finally found her joy. Here, no one told Margaret to temper her fervor. In addition to the prayers prescribed by the rule, she included for herself the 150 Psalms of David, the office of the Blessed Virgin, and the office of the Holy Cross. All of this she knew by memory. It is said that most of what Margaret learned and memorized was by infused knowledge. as she would learn an assortment of lengthy prayers in a matter of hours, or sometimes instantaneously. Along with vocal prayer, she would meditate almost constantly. She meditated on the sufferings of Jesus from the time he was born in a stable to his death on the cross. In imitation of St. Dominic, she began to rise at midnight for prayer, but instead of going back to sleep, she would stay up to pray for the rest of the night. In addition, she would scourge herself 3 times a day in imitation of St. Dominic. This she did with the permission of her confessor. When she wasn't praying, she would use her time to visit the sick, regardless of the distance or the time of day or night. For the dying, she helped them have a holy death. If they were unrepentant, she would plead with them, and if that didn't work, she would pray for them. Rarely did anyone die with an unrepentant heart. Margaret continued to live from house to house, but now it was the wealthy that took her in. One very wealthy family that loved Margaret as their own gave her the best room of the house. After showing her around, she realized how big the room was and how plush the pillows and blankets were. It took some doing, but she managed to convince the family to let her sleep in their attic with a simple bed, and this is where she stayed for the rest of her life. Although Margaret hated being the center of attention, God allowed her holiness to be known. Miracles began to happen when Margaret prayed. There were conversions, illnesses that were cured, and events that she prophesied. One of the women in the Montalate was told that she was going blind from a tumor, and she went to Margaret for comfort. After unsuccessfully trying to convince the woman that God had given her a gift with this cross, as she knew well, she put her hand over the eye of the woman, and the tumor miraculously disappeared. Margaret and the Montalate women also visited the prisoners in jail after hearing they lived in destitute conditions to the point of starvation. They supplied them with food, bedding, and medical care. One time, there was a prisoner named Alonso, who no one dared to come near, as he was so violent with his blasphemies against God that it frightened everyone away. He was very angry with God for allowing his wife and son to go hungry while he was in prison, and even angrier when he was told his little boy died of starvation. As long as no one tried to talk to him about God, he promised he would not blaspheme around the women so that he could get food and care for his skin ulcers. But seeing that he was struggling to not blaspheme, Margaret began to silently pray. Turning around to face her, he was shocked to find her suspended in the air, with her head thrown back, facing heaven. Her face, normally described as ugly, became radiant and beautiful. In a choked voice he said, "Little Margaret, please pray for me." This levitation was not a one-time thing, but happened nearly every day. It was witnessed not only by the prisoners, but also by the people of the town, who were able to give witness to the phenomenon. The stories of Margaret spread far and wide, and soon people everywhere began to seek her out for her prayers. Although Margaret took care to always keep the divine favors as secret as possible, she was forced, under obedience, to admit to her confessor that in addition to these gifts from God, she was also able to see Jesus during the consecration of the Mass. Thinking she meant that she saw him interiorly with her imagination, Margaret corrected him, saying, "Father, since you have commanded me to reveal to you the innermost secrets of my heart, I must repeat to you what I have said before. From the consecration until the communion, I do not see the priest, the crucifix, or the missal, or anything else, but I do see Christ our Lord." In 1320, Margaret became ill. Her illness, along with her severe penances and her ardent longing to fly to heaven, hastened her death. She requested the lady of the house to get a priest, and quickly, news spread through town that little Margaret was dying. After receiving communion for the last time, Margaret died. It was April 13th, 1320. Margaret was 33 years old. Normally we would end the story here, but this last story must be told. In those days, when someone died in the warmer climate, the body was buried the same day that the person died, and so a funeral procession was quickly formed, and Margaret's body was placed on the wooden frame, which the Dominicans began to carry outside the church. But once people saw where they were headed, they blocked them from leaving, protesting, Don't take her to the cloister. Bury her in the church. She is a saint." The friars tried to explain to the people that although Margaret was indeed very holy and most likely a saint, it was the church's decision to make that judgment after an investigation. This didn't matter to the people, who continued to protest and were getting louder by the minute. The pallbearers, tired of holding the wooden frame that served as a bier, lowered the body to the ground until the argument was settled. At that moment, as the argument continued, a man and a woman holding their young crippled daughter, who was also mute, came in. Ignoring the crowd, they walked up to the body of Margaret and placed their daughter beside it, praying to Margaret for a cure. The people, moved by the sight, forgot their argument and began to pray with the parents, imploring Margaret to cure the young girl. "Margaret, little Margaret, you yourself were a cripple. Have pity on this poor child. Little Margaret, you are a good friend of God. Beg him to have mercy on this unfortunate." Suddenly, the left arm of Margaret rose up slowly. The people all at once became silent, unable to believe their eyes. The arm rose and touched the girl who lay beside her, and after a shocked moment, the girl slowly stood up and then screamed, "I have been cured! I have been cured through Margaret's prayers." Because of this miracle and all who witnessed it, Margaret's body was reverently placed in a coffin and buried in the church.